Thank you, Ted. Thank you for the warm welcome, everybody, and thank you to the organizers of Marine Money Week for the invitation today. Now, for those of you who don't know me, as Ted said, I'm a U.S. Senator from the state of Arizona, and you may be asking this question. I get this a lot. What is a senator from Arizona, a landlocked desert state, doing at a maritime event? Why does this guy care about this? Well, if you spent just one summer in Phoenix especially, you will realize why we dream of water more than most of you. But seriously, the U.S. Merchant Marine and the maritime industry is incredibly important to me. My grandfather served in the Atlantic Ocean during World War II aboard a Liberty ship. My other grandfather was in the Pacific in the United States Navy. And before I became a senator or commanded the space shuttle or flew in the Navy, I was a midshipman at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, graduating in 1986, actually 39 years ago today. That's when I graduated. And I graduated with a third mate and a third assistant engineer's license. And while at the Merchant Marine Academy, I served on merchant vessels across the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, where as a teenager and in my early 20s, I was able to get a tremendous amount of experience and quite a lot of responsibility, especially on my second sea year when we had an issue with a third mate. He had a heart condition. We were probably a quarter of the way out into the Pacific Ocean, and the captain of the ship said to my fellow cadet aboard the ship, a guy named Mark Baden, who's a United Airlines pilot now, he said, "You guys are now the third mates, and you're going to split up the shifts." And I was 21 years old at the time. I'm also the first United States Senator or member of Congress to graduate from the Merchant Marine Academy, and I understand how critical the U.S. Merchant Marine is and our maritime industry is to our national and economic security. With oceans to both the east and the west, we've always been a maritime nation, and more than 80% of goods imported to this country come by sea, making the maritime domain critical to our economic well-being. And just as importantly, maritime transportation logistics are critical to national security. In a prolonged conflict overseas, the U.S. and our allies are going to have to rely on the U.S. Merchant Marine to provide the sea lift we need to support overseas operations. But of course, as all of you know, the U.S. flag is nearly non-existent in international maritime commerce today. Of the more than 50,000 ocean-going vessels sailing the seas today to support global trade, just 80 of those ships fly the U.S. flag. Almost none of those vessels were built in the United States. And despite the decline in the size of our maritime industry, we're still facing a shortage of mariners that we need to man these ships. And the consequences of this failure is serious to our country. Because while the United States Merchant Marine has retreated, our near peer, or I think it's fair to say our peer adversary, China, has been doing the opposite. Today, more than 5,500 ocean-going vessels operate under the Chinese flag. Chinese shipyards hold 62% of the global order for merchant vessels set to be built over the next decade. And Chinese entities have invested hundreds of millions of dollars around the world in strategic ports and technologies which enable global commerce. Now, to be clear, I do not believe the United States should want or seek conflict with China. But I do believe that the best way to avoid a conflict is for the Chinese to understand that in any conflict with us, they're not going to do well. But unfortunately, in the maritime domain, whether it's strategic sea lift for the U.S. military or the opportunity to leverage control of maritime supply chains for economic coercion, the United States needs to be doing a lot more. Addressing all of these challenges requires us to comprehensively rethink our national maritime strategy. We haven't had one. And for the first time in 50 years, we've seen leaders in the United States in both parties begin to take the steps to do that. In the last administration, last December, I introduced legislation that I've been working on over, I'd say, at least half of my time in the Senate, called the Ships for America Act, which is supported by both Republicans and Democrats in both the House and the Senate. And in January, the Biden administration's U.S. trade rep concluded that China had unreasonably targeted the maritime and shipbuilding industries to manipulate the industry globally. And as I'm sure you know, this finding has led to the United States to propose some actions to counter China's unfair trade practices. And in April, President Trump signed an executive order to revitalize and rebuild the U.S. maritime industry, which called for a number of actions that echoed the steps in our legislation, the Ships for America Act. So in other words, over the past year, there's been an emerging bipartisan consensus in Washington, which is rare, to focus on revitalizing this industry. And that's a good thing. And look, that's something unique and notable in its own right. And it's, pretty rare in this administration that we, or any administration, that we really, work well together. I mean, we see it, I would say, in the Senate a little bit more than the House. But we need to do more on so many different fronts. And I want to be clear, I fully understand the scope of the challenge that we are seeking to overcome. It is a big challenge. It's going to take some time, and it's going to require the U.S. government to send a clear and consistent signal to the maritime industry. And I want all of you to understand that my goal is to ensure that our maritime revitalization efforts provide certainty to the industry across administrations. And this is coming, from a guy who's probably spent more time thinking about this issue longer than just about anybody else in Congress. And hopefully that means something. And to be clear, I can't speak to the actions being taken by the President or the U.S. trade rep, and I'll be the first to admit that the last few months of trade policy announced by the President has been, I think it's fair to say, chaotic. But I do want to take a few minutes to talk about the Ships for America Act, which I reintroduced earlier this year with even greater support in Congress and support from industry leaders. Because I do fully understand that tariff rates and regulatory changes, which change day to day, make it really hard for anybody to consider a long-term investment decision. I understand that. And as we drafted the Ships for America Act, our legislation is crafted to provide a long-term, consistent demand signal that provides the certainty needed to make some long-term decisions on where you're going to invest. So let me explain here a little bit about what it does. At the very high level, it does four things. First, it provides national oversight for maritime issues in this country, and it requires the President to name a national maritime security advisor and creating a maritime security board to develop and implement a national maritime strategy across the federal government. The bill also provides consistent support for the maritime industry by creating a maritime security trust fund, which captures the taxes and the fees that are already paid by the maritime industry, and it reinvests it back into the industry to support these programs. We did this specifically to make sure that there was both a cohesive national strategy established across the whole of government, and to ensure that funding would be in place long-term to support this strategy. Second, the Ships for America Act works to make U.S. flag vessels cost competitive in international commerce. Our bill creates new incentives for commercial shippers to consider moving cargo aboard U.S. flagged vessels. It creates new investment tax credits to offset the costs of bringing a new ship into the U.S. flagged fleet. It reforms and streamlines outdated Coast Guard regulations and makes it easier to flag into the U.S. registry. And most importantly, the bill establishes a new program called the Strategic Commercial Fleet, which would bring 250 new U.S. flagged vessels into the fleet over the next 10 years. We do that by providing financial support to offset the construction and operating differences to the carriers who provide the best value to our economic and national security. This program is important because right now there aren't any U.S. government programs that provide capital support for U.S.-built vessels in international commerce. And uniquely, this program would also scale operating support by the vessel type, the routes the vessels operate on, rather than just being a fixed annual stipend. All of this is done to make operating a U.S. flagged ship economically competitive on the global stage. The third thing that the Ships for America Act does is it would revive the American shipbuilding and ship repair industry. It creates new tax incentives for shipyards. It streamlines federal regulations for shipyard operations. And it incentivizes U.S. shipyards to modernize to be able to compete against the most advanced shipyards on the planet. Lastly, our bill makes historic investments in workforce development for the maritime industry. It creates a national recruiting campaign so people know about this industry. It invests in training facilities, and it invests in our maritime academies, not just the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, but the state schools as well. It provides incentives for mariners to stay in the industry, and it modernizes the mariner credentialing system in this country. I always point out when people come to my office the difference between my 2 Coast Guard licenses and my pilot's license. I got the Coast Guard licenses in 1986. I got the pilot's license after I finished flight school in 1987. The pilot's license is good for the rest of my life. I never had to do anything to renew it. It's the same piece of paper. Coast Guard licenses, every 5 years. And if you don't do it, you're out of luck and you got to start all over again. We need to fix that. So taken together, our legislation is the most comprehensive maritime legislation to be considered by Congress in a generation. And I want to emphasize that the politics of this legislation, it works really well right now. Not only does our legislation address a critical vulnerability for our national defense, but it also counters Chinese influence on the global stage, in the global economy, while reinvesting in our economy to bring more jobs and manufacturing back to the United States. That's a political winner for Republicans and for Democrats and for the administration. In the coming months, I'm going to be working with my colleagues in Congress and in the administration to get our legislation signed into law and then implemented to make sure we're attracting new investments in the U.S. flag fleet and our shipyard industrial base. And I know that what we're doing is an enormous undertaking. I get that. And it just might be because I am an eternal optimist. But I know we can get this done. And I've been an optimist for most of my career because, after all, I'm the guy who had to climb into the spaceship 4 times built by the lowest bidder. You got to be an optimist. But in all seriousness, if you haven't already reviewed the legislation, I encourage you to start taking a look at it and figure out how you can take advantage of this legislation when it passes. And I also want to say, while you're reviewing it, if you have any ideas to make it better, let us know. my staff is very happy to work with you on this to improve the legislation. We're going to have a committee process and eventually a floor process to get this thing across the finish line, because the global maritime industry really needs a strong American presence on the high seas. The United States, we are the strongest military in the world, and we're the world's largest economy. The very fabric of our modern-day global trading system, which the maritime industry relies upon, has been developed in the United States and continues to be protected by the United States Navy to this day. And this global trading system, which we all benefit from, has allowed innovation and fair competition to flourish for decades, allowing any company and any country who can find a way to build or operate a ship more efficiently to do that. But a world where China becomes the dominant power on the high seas is a very different world. In any industry which the Chinese target for dominance, their strategy is to make the entire global industry dependent on Chinese, state-controlled, state-subsidized companies. And they're going to engage in unfair trade practices. They're going to steal IP, and they're going to do more to make that happen. And I don't think any of us want to see that happen to the maritime industry. And my hope is that as we seek to revitalize the U.S. maritime industry and counter China's rising influence, we'll be able to do so alongside our allies and our partners around the globe. And we have a lot of them. And in fact, I think we've already seen indication that the global industry is beginning to look at investing in the United States once again. Last year, Hanwha purchased and began investing in the what was the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, to build world-class vessels. I visited that shipyard just a few months ago. And earlier this year, CMA, CGM expanded the size of their U.S. flag fleet. And there's so much more to come. And in the near future, I hope and I believe we'll successfully create a U.S. maritime industry that folks are excited to be a part of. After all, surrounded by water on both sides, America has always been a maritime nation. And working together with all of you, I know that we can reclaim our maritime heritage. So I look forward to getting to work on this. Please take a close look at the legislation, and please continue to talk about it. That is incredibly important, especially if you're in front of a member of the House or the Senate. Thank you very much.